Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 5 of Global Conversations. My name is Nick.
And I'm Amanda. Today on Around the World in 10 Minutes, we examine the Cambodian garment workers' strike, followed by the French hand gesture that's polarizing French society.
Later in the podcast, we bring you a discussion with Master of Global Affairs student Noureen Ramzey on her experience as an Egyptian during the Arab Spring, followed by an interview with Professor Matt Hoffmann on his take on recent climate change conferences. It is not uncommon for developing countries around the world to have weak labor laws and poor working conditions. In an appeal to the global market, such laws keep overhead costs low for the production of goods that are sold to Western markets. This has long been the pattern of Cambodia, where the garment industry takes in between $4 to $6 billion a year. In fact, the garment industry is the largest sector of the Cambodian economy. Yet, the past 12 months has seen widespread protests by garment workers in the country, protests that are political and violent. Public grievances began in early 2013 when garment worker unions began lobbying for wages of $160 a month, up from just $65. In response, the government raised the monthly minimum wage to just $80 and then begrudgingly raised it again to $95. At barely half of what the unions were asking for, $95 was just not enough to please the workers. When this amount was announced last December, the streets of the capital, Phnom Penh, were flooded with tens of thousands of protesters. The government of Cambodia responded to the protests with violence. 37 protesters were injured and 4 were killed. The government has banned public demonstrations and protests and looked poised to continue the violence. The Prime Minister of Cambodia is Mr. Hun Sen, a man who has been in power for 29 years and who was a commander in the Khmer Rouge, the regime that was responsible for the genocide of 2 million Cambodians before defecting. He owes his continued grip on power to an election that outside observers called unfair, and his time as Prime Minister has been one marked by authoritarianism and corruption. Despite the election being suspicious, the major opposition parties gained 44% of the popular vote, which is an astounding figure considering the political control that they were up against. I was actually in Cambodia this past July during the elections, speaking with folks out in support of the opposition parties. The rallies were huge, all day and night peaceful demonstrations of support. People knew full well that the election results had been wrapped up, but they still rallied on with unwavering support and determination. But democracy still does not truly exist in Cambodia, and thousands of workers are not being paid what they believe they should be. Although on face value the garment worker strikes look to be only about labor rights, they represent larger trends of political change in the country.
And now on to the second story. It's called La Canelle. It has its own trademark and clothing line. It's the gesture that's polarized the French, sparked controversy on the football pitch in England, and raised questions about freedom of speech and the possible resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe. The gesture consists of pointing towards the ground with one flattened hand while folding the other arm across the chest. The controversial French comedian Dieudonné Mbala popularized the gesture when he ran as part of an anti-Zionist group vying for a seat in the European Parliament. His act has mocked the Holocaust, and he has once implied that a French Jewish radio presenter belongs in the gas chambers. His opponents say the canal is manifestly anti-Semitic, an inverted Nazi salute. His fans, however, say it's not anti-Semitic at all, it's merely anti-establishment. But the joke's on Dieudonné because France's highest administrative court has decided to uphold a ban preventing the artist from taking the stage, citing his performances as a risk to public order. His supporters don't see it that way. For them, it's about censorship and denying the right to freedom of expression. In fact, riot police had to be called in to the French city of Nantes to quell protests that erupted after fans were informed that Dieudonné's performances were cancelled. Thanks to social media, the canal gesture has gone viral throughout Europe, with numerous people sharing their photographs of giving the canal salutes in various places, some of which are quite disturbing, such as Auschwitz, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, and a Jewish school in Toulouse that was the site of a massacre in 2012. In December, the canal controversy traveled across the English Channel when French footballer Nicolas Anelka performed the gesture after scoring a goal for West Bromwich Albion. He said the gesture was merely a middle finger to the man in solidarity with Dieudonné and not anti-Semitic. The English Football Association is considering suspending him for a number of games. Still, the widespread popularity of the gesture has raised concerns that anti-Semitism is becoming socially acceptable in Europe once again, and that there is a more receptive audience in Europe than before. Civil liberties groups, center-right politicians, and the center-left newspaper Le Monde have criticized the decision of the top French court. The comedian plans to appeal the ruling, and he may well succeed. In recent years, he has had over 5 previous attempts to prevent him from appearing due to anti-Semitic utterances struck down in the courts. Writer S.G. Tallentire summed up Voltaire's attitude in France during the 18th century as, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." 3 centuries later, and it's a debate that's as salient as ever. Next, we bring you an interview by Ali McHugh with Master of Global Affairs student Noureen Ramzey discussing her experiences as an Egyptian during the Arab Spring.
Today I'm talking with Noureen Ramzey, an MGA1 student who lived in Cairo until she moved to Canada for the Munk program. So Noureen was in Egypt during the Arab Spring in 2010. Thank you for joining us today, Noureen.
Thank you for having me.
So after the Arab Spring, did things change in Egypt substantially from your perspective, or were they pretty much the same? What differences did you notice?
I'm going to have to say they did change big time. Right now, things are very different, but in very different ways than compared to right after 2011. I think most people right now think of their lives pre-revolution and post-revolution, like no one even remembers what life was like before 2011. So I would definitely say things were substantially different. I don't know if that translates into politics, because Egypt's kind of coming full circle like right now, just going back to where we were before. But that doesn't change the fact that the past few years have changed a lot, both in like the perception of people of how politics works, of how democracy works, of how human rights should be perceived in society. So I think definitely substantial changes.
Very recently, there were bombings in Cairo that were directed at the police and infrastructure. So the authorities are blaming these on the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood's blaming it on security. Is there still a lot of support for the Muslim Brotherhood?
I wouldn't say a lot. I would say that their support has receded big time just to accommodate their own existing constituency that's always been there, that's never going to go anywhere. But for the majority of Egyptians, everyone's extremely outraged, and everyone, even before the bombings, everyone is just against them and against what they stood for, against their year, and everyone's just supporting anything that's not the Muslim Brotherhood right now.
So with the revolution, there's been a lot of debate as to whether it's actually been a success or not, given that there's still ongoing conflict and everything. From your perspective, do you think it's been successful in making headway and making change, or do you think it's kind of just been more of the same but slightly different in the lens of politics?
So I think it has been a success in ways that are not directly quantifiable through politics. I think politically it hasn't. It's just like prompted a change, which is something that's completely unheard of in Egyptian politics in general. So even if we're just evaluating that aspect of it, that has happened. I think there were gains in terms of just how informed people are in terms of politics, how there's less fear of authority, which is something that was very present during the police state under Mubarak. I think these were the main gains. The French Revolution took years to actually happen and manifest, like just its principles to take root in the actual society. So I'm just reluctant to make a call on whether or not I think of it as a success or a failure 3 years or 4 years into it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with us today.
Thank you.
Next, we bring you an interview with Faria Hussein with Professor Matt Hoffmann on his take on the recent climate change conferences.
Hello, this is Faria Hussein from Global Conversations with a special guest, Matthew Hoffmann. He is an associate professor of political science and a co-director of the Environmental Governance Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on global environmental governance and more specifically, the global response to climate change. Thank you for speaking with us.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
So, Matt, I just wanted to start off with asking you about the most recent climate talks in Warsaw. You predicted that these talks would be a failure, and what did you and would you describe it as such still, and why?
Yes, that was actually a pretty easy prediction to make. It was pretty clear that the talks in Warsaw weren't going to come up with much in the way of climate agreement, and it turns out that turned out to be true, unfortunately.
what was the shortcomings of the actual agreement? Like, what could have they done better? What was?
Well, I'm not actually sure there's anything they could have done better at Warsaw itself. The Warsaw negotiations weren't any more problematic than any of the negotiations we've had in the last couple of years. The problem is that we have a structure of negotiations where we have 190 countries around the table trying to negotiate climate change, and we have entrenched debates and entrenched irreconcilable interests around the table. These interests haven't really changed in the last 20 years, and it's those interests that are stopping us from moving ahead. And so you have large developing countries like China and India that don't want to move forward on climate change. You have large developed countries like the United States and Canada who also don't want to move ahead on climate change, but for different reasons. And with these major blocks of countries not willing to move progressively, the negotiations cannot move forward. So it's not a problem at the negotiations themselves, it's what the countries bring to the table when they show up at the negotiations.
I think one last question I wanted to ask before we wrap up. It was about the future framework. I mean, that's something that of Kyoto or of the future climate agreement, something that's going to come up soon is Paris 2015, the new climate talk, and a lot of the buzz has been around, Kyoto, post-Kyoto era. Do we continue on do you foresee us continuing on a cap-and-trade system or a reformulated cap-and-trade system, or is there any talk on how it's going to be reformulated or whether it will be?
Well, we won't see a global cap-and-trade system in Paris in 2015. Right, and so that died in the early 2000s when the U.S. pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, and the remnants of it is in the European emissions trading system. I have only a small bit of hope that Paris will generate something substantial. I think we're more likely to see something that looks like what we got in Copenhagen more recently, which was a series of pledges, individual-based pledges, on emissions reductions. So the United States will pledge what they're willing to commit to. Canada will pledge what they're willing to commit to. And then the debate will be over how to monitor those and whether those are legally binding commitments. I do not think that we will see a global deal on emissions reductions.
Thank you very much, Matt Hoffman. I appreciate the interview.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Global Conversations, produced by students in the Master of Global Affairs program at the Munk School of Global Affairs. The executive producers of Global Conversations are Michelle Park and Nathaniel Dove, and assistant producer Simon Bakra. Staff appearing in this episode are Amanda Coletta, Faria Hussein, Ali McHugh, and myself, Nick D'Agostino. A special thank you to guests Professor Matt Hoffmann and Noureen Ramzey.